Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to this webinar on uh, understanding school resource officers. And I just wanted to start with a bit of context, and then I will introduce our panelists for this evening. I really wanted to organize this forum because over the past several months, our community has been having a really emotional and passionate debate, which is centered in the emotional and passionate debate that our entire country is having right now. But locally, we've focused on the role of police in our society, and particularly in the role of school resource officers in our school. And as the state senator for Ellicott City, Western Howard County, and Southern Carroll County, I feel like one of my jobs is to try to bring state resources down to the local level. And so in this particular debate, I am not a decision maker. But I did have access to some really great experts from the Maryland Center for School Safety, who I thought I could bring to this webinar to help answer some questions. And they've worked on the laws that govern us and the requirements applicable to SROs. And so I really hope that they can answer some of your questions. Before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge that today would have been George Floyd's 47th birthday. And he should be alive to celebrate, and instead his family and friends will spend the day mourning. So it's just so, important that every single, statistic has a name. And since his murder, we've marched the streets for racial justice to make sure that our Black and brown neighbors are treated with dignity and equity under the law. And so we find ourselves in the middle of this passionate debate. And so hopefully what I can bring today is statistics and resources and experts to help us address this question. I think one of the things that we all share, I'm a mother of two. My daughters are now 14 and 11. And I think everybody who has a kid in school wants their kid to be safe. But we all have, different experiences of what that safety means. And it is very true that there are racial disparities in law enforcement and in the way that laws are enforced for individuals with disabilities. And so I had a really interesting conversation. I want to thank Andy Kopp from the ARC of Maryland for emailing our office today. My chief of staff had a conversation, and they talked through some of the data that's out there. So based on 2018 and 2019 data, Black students made up of about 24% of the student population in Howard County, but 64% of that population of school arrests. And students with disabilities made up about 10% of the student population, but 25% of those arrests. Now, how you interpret that data in the wider context of the racial injustice that perpetrates all of our society is something that our experts today are going to help us with. Let's see. I also want to just be mindful of the fact that the Howard County Public School System is going through a process right now that involves robust community engagement. And many of you are participating in these focus groups or would like to participate in the upcoming town hall. And following this presentation, Nathan's going to send out both the slides and a link to where you can get more engaged with the Howard County Public School System. And so that's kind of an overview of why we've organized this forum. Once again, I don't have a role in decision making, but I really wanted to bring together people who could provide evidence from the state level. With that said, I want to introduce our speakers for tonight. And I want to start by thanking Rich Gibson for being here. Rich Gibson is our very own state's attorney here in Howard County, and he will be presenting on the role that SROs play in Howard County. Rich, just give a wave to everybody so they know who you are.
Hey, everyone.
So Rich is the first African-American to serve as Howard County State's Attorney. He began his career with the Prince George's County State's Attorney in 2004, and he later secured employment with the Baltimore City State's Attorney Office. So you've really been all over it, Rich. He rose to the ranks from the General Trial Division to the Homicide Division, and eventually became the team captain in the Major Investigations Unit, where he supervised a team of trial attorneys who were focused on prosecuting violent repeat offenders. So thank you for being here tonight, Rich. Okay, now in terms of the Maryland Center for School Safety, we are going to start off with Dawn Lukey, And Dawn just waved to everybody. After 12 years in private litigation, Dawn joined the Office of the Attorney General in 2013. She serves as counsel to the Maryland Center for School Safety and the Maryland Longitudinal Data System Center and Active Assailant Interdisciplinary Work Group. And she works on hate crimes and hate bias community outreach initiatives and law enforcement training. And Dawn actually literally wrote the book on the Safe to Learn Act, and she will be presenting on definitions and policies governing SROs in the state. Following Dawn, we will have Mike Rudinsky and Dr. Tarek Hill from the Maryland Center for School Safety. And they're actually going to be walking us through the training and the additional policies governing SROs in Maryland. So Mike is a school safety specialist, training and evaluation specialist at the Maryland Center for School Safety. And in addition to having regional responsibility for schools in Prince George's County, Charles County, Calvert County, and St. Mary's County Public Schools, he is a project manager for the training portion of the Maryland Safe to Learn Act. He is responsible for training and certifying all SROs and school security employees in Maryland. That is a big role. Dr. Tarek Harris has been with the Maryland Center for School Safety for over a year. Prior to joining, Dr. Harris served as a special educator, school counselor, and a college and high school administrator for 24 years. As the school prevention and intervention specialist, Dr. Harris collaborates with local school districts in providing organizational, operational, and technical direction to school systems in the areas of school violence and critical incident prevention. As a former administrator, Dr. Harris helped to develop the course, Understanding the SRO, which is a course designed for school administrators who work with school resource officers in Maryland schools. So, following their presentations, which we think will comprise like the first 20 to 30 minutes of tonight's discussion, we'll then open up the floor for Q&A, where you'll be able to answer your questions. Now, I'd like to thank everybody participating who's already mailed in their questions, and we'll probably start with a few of the most commonly asked questions, which Nathan has managed to compile. But if you didn't get a chance to submit your question, please message Nathan during this debate, and he will try to get them answered. And if we run out of time, then once again, we'll follow up over email. So with that introduction, I would like to turn it over to Dawn and ask Nathan to bring up Dawn's slides, and we will start the presentation.
Hi, everyone. While he's loading up the slides, this is basically the first portion of what we're going to talk about tonight is to give you an overview of what the law requires related to SROs and their role in our school system. And then Mike will talk about actual policing experience and community policing and where we are now, and then we'll pass to Rich. So you can move to the first slide. So really this started with the enactment of the Safe to Learn Act in 2018. That law was passed following the tragic events at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, began work on various school safety bills during that legislative session. And then of course we had our own tragic school shooting down in St. Mary's County with the loss of Jalen Willie at Great Mills High School. And the Safe to Learn Act was a product of the concern that folks had for school safety at that time and the multiple facets to it. So the law is structured as a multidisciplinary approach to school safety and maintaining a positive school climate. And it requires collaboration between our local school systems, local law enforcement departments, the Center for School Safety, and the Maryland State Department of Education. So it did a few things. These are some of the highlights because it's a very lengthy statute, but it increased funding and responsibilities for the local school system and the state related to school safety. And that includes funding for mental health services or initiatives and other training, outreach, and wraparound services. The creation of statewide standards for school safety, a requirement that they standardize training and certification of all school resource officers in the state, the requirement for each school system to develop a behavioral threat assessment team. So the Center for School Safety had to put together a model policy, and then each local school system had to adopt a policy consistent with that which had some additional elements for the school systems to consider and draft in their policies. And then it created a bunch of different reporting requirements for use of force, both by school resource officers and school safety employees, critical life-threatening incidents that occur on school premises or school grounds, different drills and lockdowns and safety evaluations of all of the physical plants of the school systems, as well as whether the schools have a school resource officer assigned or what we call adequate law enforcement coverage. Next slide. So the Safe to Learn Act of 2018 was the first time that an SRO was ever defined anywhere in Maryland law. And here is the definition of it. So it includes any law enforcement officers that are defined under Section 3101 of the Public Safety Article. They have to be assigned to the school to provide services and must have a memorandum of understanding between their law enforcement agency and the school system. And that it also includes Baltimore City Schools Police, which have their own separate definition under Maryland law, and they don't have an MOU because they are part of the school system. They are not a separate law enforcement agency. Next slide. You've heard me mention a couple times now the term school security employee, because there are other folks who work within our public schools who are not sworn law enforcement officers. So there's definitions related to that within this law, as well as in the regulation that you see cited there that was enacted following the passage of the statute. So they are not school resource officers, but they are employed by local school systems to provide safety and security related services. And so they also have a position called the school safety coordinator, and each one of our 24 school systems in Maryland must have a designated school safety coordinator. And some of them also have school security directors. So our school safety coordinators are the liaison between the school system, local law enforcement in their jurisdiction, and the Center for School Safety. Next slide. The center was required under the Safe to Learn Act to develop some guidelines to help school systems figure out whether they needed school resource officers in their schools or whether they could have what we call adequate law enforcement coverage. So one of the biggest misunderstandings is that there seems to be a misconception that somehow Maryland requires a school resource officer in every school or in every high school or every middle school, et cetera. It does not. The law does not specifically mandate the use of an SRO, but it says that they have to either have an SRO or they have to have this plan for coverage to support the school safety at their facility. So there's a lot of different things that go into consideration for a school system when they're making that choice and decision, but that ultimately rests with the local school system to decide. They provide that information annually, that there's a public report, so you can view the report to see which school systems use SROs and in what capacity. The center also, this December 1st is the first time that the use of force report that is due to the agency will be provided to the Governor and General Assembly. So that comes December 1st. The law, though, as a whole is written to involve law enforcement or school resource officer in the participation of multidisciplinary things, such as requirement that someone with law enforcement expertise must participate on the school system's behavioral threat assessment teams. And each school system has to define on their school system website what the role and the authority of a school resource officer is within their school system. Next slide. So I want to talk about the training. The law required that the Center for School Safety develop a training curriculum for school resource officers and the school security employees. And so in order to put this together, this was done by convening a group of different subject matter experts. So we had school counselors, administrators, law enforcement, Center for School Safety staff, and State Department of Education staff figuring out how to put this together. And out of that was born these topics. Now, some of them are in fact required by the Safe to Learn Act itself. So the law itself did specify that they had to include training on de-escalation, disability awareness, maintaining a positive school climate, constructive interactions with students, and implicit bias and disability and diversity awareness with specific attention to racial and ethnic disparities. That's written into the law. So Maryland was on the forefront of school safety legislation in 2018 and in terms of what it required of its training curriculum. One additional topic that we added based on a survey that we did where we had over 1,200 stakeholders participate and provide feedback was doing trauma-informed interventions as a part of that training curriculum. So if you can click on the slide, it'll highlight the, there you go. These are the topics that are part of this training program. It's a week-long program, 40 hours. And all the ones that you see highlighted in pink are ones which are taught by subject matter experts. So, for example, I teach the school law segment, or I teach the memorandum of understanding segment. I teach hate bias and hate crimes, right? But there are folks who come in who aren't just the center's staff who come in and work on these. And during the summer of 2019, we trained, I believe, just under 1,000 individuals, school resource officers and school security employees all across the state of Maryland. I put a lot of miles on my car, and we were able to gather a lot of feedback from the SROs too that was helpful and informed what Dr. Harris worked on with respect to the understanding the role of the SRO class to put together for administrators, right? So it was collaborative and not just a lecture. Next slide. I'm gonna pass it over to Mike, who's gonna give you some history about the roles of school police over time and where we are and where we're headed.
Very good. Can you all hear me? All right. Thanks for having me, everybody. I'd like to start off just talking to you about policing in general. And they didn't do much on my background. I actually have 34 years law enforcement experience. I'm a retired school resource officer. I went to entry-level training when I retired and trained entry-level police officers. And that's where the Maryland Center found me. I had been training SROs nationally for several years. And naturally, I came over to the center. So they asked me actually when I was teaching entry level to help write the curriculum, and that's where I come in to play. So there are different types of policing. First of all, you have traditional policing. It involves officers answering calls, patrolling their communities. You see it all every day, looking for crimes that have occurred and that are occurring. Please click the slide. It's reactive. That's something that traditional policing is. You react to what you see. Click the slide again, please. Officers respond to a variety of situations they develop. They spend their shifts addressing challenges and issues as they come up. They are fixers, ladies and gentlemen. Police officers in general are fixers. They go somewhere, they fix the problem, and they move on to the next problem. Next slide. Then there's another type of policing, and that's called community policing. This is a theory that came in the 90s. And community policing was to get police officers out of their cars and back into their communities. Some police departments do this very well. Others don't do it so well. However, it's a philosophy that promotes organizational strategies such as partners, problem-solving techniques, and proactiveness. It proactively addresses immediate conditions that give rise to public safety and quality of life issues. They use the Sarah model of problem solvings to develop a difference between a problem and a symptom of a problem. Then they're taught that they address the problem, and then they assess to see if what they have done works or if it didn't work. Community policing is a very valuable tool, and it is the basis of SRO programs nationwide. It's what we would like to see our SROs do. They're generally the definition of community policing. Dr. Harris, if you'd like to move ahead.
Sure. When we're looking at an SRO is a community-oriented police officer. It's not like the police officer that is patrolling the streets. And according to the United States Department of Justice, which defines a school resource officer as a sworn law enforcement officer that is responsible for safety and crime prevention. So when we're looking at our SROs within our schools, and we look at the importance of relationships is what allows our students to feel safe. It's what creates a culture and climate where students feel safe and learning takes place. When you look at this picture here of an SRO, you see someone that has a great relationship with the students, where when the students come to school in the morning, they're looking for that trusted adult, someone that they can feel confident and are comfortable in. The SRO is just not a law enforcement law enforcement officer is not just a law enforcement officer, but they also help educate the school community on the rules and laws of the community, as well as crime prevention strategies. You want to make sure that you keep your campus community safe. It's not just about putting your police car in front of a school building. It is actually engaging with the community, which is your parents, students, and staff. And then you enforce the law. I mean, you want to keep everybody safe. I know as a parent, it makes me feel good to know that there's someone there just in case something happens, but also preventatively wise, instilling good character in the students by getting into the classroom and talking about law education topics. Next slide. When we look at school-based law enforcement programs in Maryland, they have several different names. We have the school resource officers. In 1990, it started in Baltimore City, which is the Baltimore City Police. And as Dawn spoke earlier, they don't necessarily have an MOU. They are actually hired through the school, actual Baltimore City Police School Board, and they're in our schools. And then in 1994, in Prince George's County, they were in Greenbelt. And then in 1998, the SROs branched out into Baltimore County, Hartford County, and Hyattsville City Police, which are all three great programs. And we also have, in some of our central office staff, we have what we call school district police, where we have ex-police officers that are assigned to the school districts and the school superintendents. And if we look at higher education, Maryland Center for School Safety, we also have a office on Bowie State University campus. And most campuses have campus police. And then a lot of our schools, if they don't necessarily have a school resource officer assigned to that school, we also have school security officers, which also goes through our mandated training. And then we also have liaison officers that work between schools and districts, that are liaison between the community and the school. Next slide. If we look at the roles of an SRO, I would say that the SRO is truly the most diverse position in law enforcement. They have several roles. Here you can click on the first one. They're an informal counselor. As I stated earlier, when I was working in my school and I had working closely with my school resource officer, my school resource officer was a mentor, was also one of my coaches on my soccer team. And so you want to be able to have a relationship with your students where you're not someone that the students fear, you're not someone that the parents fear, but someone that's a part of the community, that you're actually a part of the staff. Yes, the administrator is not that SRO supervisor, but you want to have someone there that can talk to the students that really needs that trusted adult to share some information with. Next one. You have an educator. A lot of times we want our school resource officers to get into the classroom, and a lot of times our school resource officers, they have a lot to talk about, a lot to discuss, and we have different curriculums like street law, where our educators can get into the classroom and talk about law-specific topics for our students, because you have some students that may want to go into the area of law enforcement or criminal justice. Next one. We also have serve as emergency managers. When we think about When I was in the schools as a school counselor and a teacher, administrator, I know that when there were times where there was an emergency, if there needed an ambulance, or we had to do certain fire drills, or if there was a tornado drill, or if there was a shelter in place, we would want that school resource officer that has that experience in that background in emergency planning to take the lead. And that administrator should defer to the school resource officer at that time, who at that moment is the emergency manager, making sure that we're getting the students safe and returning home safely to their parents. And lastly, law enforcement. You know, our school resource officers, they go through the academy. They're sworn officers, but our school resource officers, they go through specific training that they have, where they take certain courses that are specific to children, because the way you interact with our children is not the same way that you would interact with our children in the community.
All right, what an SRO is not. A school resource officer is not a school employee. They're not a school administrator. They are not a disciplinarian and should not be involved in school discipline. They're not a taxi driver. They're not there to just give students a ride home at the end of the day. And they're not assigned to the school only for active assailant response or for response to crime. Next slide. Let's talk about arrests. Understanding the role of the SRO is a program that we put on, and actually we will be putting that on the 21st again. Anybody can sign up for it. I'll get that information out. We deal in that program with what's called the mays and the shalls. Mays and shalls are words that are put into Maryland law that require the SRO to utilize discretion or to be required by law to arrest people. There are various things that can happen that may concern a may or a shall. Many people think that the SROs do have, or even police officers have, complete discretion on arrest, and that's just not the case. The law requires arrest in some instances. Counties are reporting that the vast majority of arrests of students by SROs are administrator initiated. Now, I was an SRO for 17 years, and I found that to be much of the case. Next slide, please. This slide was provided to me by Howard County Police Department for our presentations that we do statewide. This shows you what initiates the calls for SROs. In Howard County in this particular year, and I believe, Dawn, you may know better, but I think it was like 2017 and 18. Is that correct? Well, I don't know if Dawn's there. At any rate, at that time, 79% of the arrests that took place in the school were information from school administrators. They were called to the administrator's office and they were asked to deal with the situation. 3% were self-initiated, and 18% were calls for service. Now that means that somebody dialed 911 and called the police. That could be an administrator or any one of the students that's witnessing an event in the school could dial 911. Next slide. Dawn mentioned adequate coverage. So the SRO versus adequate coverage. SROs are highly trained to work with youth. They're trained in relationships. They are trained in diversion from arrest. They are trained that the last thing they should do is arrest. We keep throwing around statistics of arrests that took place in high schools, and those statistics are staggering to many of us. But those statistics do not deal with the total amount of incidents of that type that occurred in the school. As a hypothetical, if you take a fight and you have 5 arrests for fights, there could have been 50 fights in the school and only 5 of them rose to that level. But we don't look at that statistic, and that's something that with our new program, as of 2019, we're really starting to take a deep dive into. The SRO has privileges to share information back and forth with the school. They know the students, they know the staff, and they have oversight of use of force by a civilian group, and that group is us. Now, bear in mind, no other police officer going into the school has that oversight. So if the school has an SRO and the SRO is not present that day, and the outside police are going to the school, that outside officer does not have to report any use of force to anybody. And only SROs have to do that. Adequate coverage generally would be your average patrol officer. They have no training to work with youth or in diversions from arrest or in de-escalation or any of the other topics SROs need to be taught: trauma-informed care, disability diversity awareness, implicit bias. They have no FERPA privileges. They don't know the staff, they don't know the students, and they don't have special reporting oversight of use of force, as I explained. It's also important to understand what it would look like if an SRO is not in a school. And in order to do that, you would have to know how many times police are called to school. From my experience, prior to me going into the school, the police department was called to the school 327 times in a 187-day period. After I went into the school as an SRO, we reduced those calls for service by 82%. We also reduced arrests. And the reason that occurs is because, I told you earlier, the police officers are fixers. When they respond to a school, they're going to fix the problem the quickest way they know how, and they're going to move out of the situation. SROs, in contrast, understand the teen brain, understand risk and reward, and how teens don't understand consequences. So they're more likely to divert young people from arrest. One of our major concerns is that if we rely on adequate coverage, the calls for service either won't change or they will go up. And in fact, the officers responding won't have the necessary training to deal with our youth. Next slide.
We have a quick request from the chat just to go back to the last slide for a second. Do you mind if we just do that for just a little bit?
No.
Sure.
So this is just the chart from the Howard County
Yes.
folks. Okay, moving on.
Thank you. And I believe we're turning it over to our good state's attorney.
Good evening, everyone. Is my mic on?
Yep.
You're all set.
Okie doke. Good evening, everyone. Is my camera working? Well, I'm having all kinds of technical difficulties.
Everything's good.
Yep,
Okay,
you're
good.
there.
All right, great. So I want to just acknowledge that there's a lot of discussion going on, as Senator Hester said earlier, and I wanted to make sure that we're providing as many facts as possible so that when people are forming opinions, they have accurate data to support those opinions. And so in Howard County, we looked at, and I had our attorneys pull the data from March 2019 through March 2020. And in that period of time, we had 255 referrals. Referrals are situations where someone is asking us to examine a perceived violation of the law and decide if we should proceed with a criminal charge or not. So we had 255 referrals from 2019 to 2020 of March. Now, obviously, COVID struck, I guess, mid-March or early March, but that's the data that we have. Of the 255 referrals, 28 came from schools. Of the 28 that came from schools, 24 came from SROs, and 4 came from patrol officers responding to a call at the school. So quick math, out of the 255 cases, the vast majority of the referrals for juveniles committing crime that we're asked to examine prosecution on are coming from the community. Somebody riding along a bike trail in Columbia when 2 individuals approach them and demand at the end of a weapon their bike. And then after they get a chance to call the police, afterwards they call the police respond, investigate, and find out that it was 2 16-year-olds that committed that robbery, right? That is the most common way that we're seeing cases. The vast majority of the 255 cases, 227 of them, came from the community, not SROs. Additionally, there's a discussion about, or one theory that's kind of fueling some thoughts on this topic of SROs is the school to prison pipeline. The school to prison pipeline is the concept that we are taking our youth, our children who are in schools, and moving them in mass from those schools to prisons, or to the criminal justice system. The issue there, next slide, please. It's important to understand how that system works. First off, I, as district attorney, act as a gatekeeper. I have 3 young Black children of my own that I'm very concerned for, and I can tell you that I would not be tolerant to that kind of system of injustice. All right, it's very important that the community feel that they are safe, and it's very important that the community feel that justice is being administered fairly. Right, and it's important to have actual facts when examining where we are on the spectrum of unfair and fair. The reality is that there are many systems of diversion, and so there are many off-ramps. I personally have a view that says juvenile justice should be rehabilitatively focused, and I have a view that says, you know, we should be trying to reform these kids whatever possible and not expose them to the system. And my prosecutors share that view. There are, of course, occasions where the crime committed by a juvenile is so egregious that it has to be met with a more punitive stance, but that is not the norm. Our norm is to seek a rehabilitative, non-punitive solution, and often to try to avoid them being exposed to the system at all. And so in terms of the off-ramps that would divert someone from coming before the justice system, you have several. The first is school administration. And so the school has the ability to evaluate the incident that's causing concern and discern whether it merits being moved up and ratcheted up to our attention, to the attention of the police or not. Of course, with felonies, that's kind of a more clear-cut thing, but with misdemeanors or minor offenses, the school can deal with it administratively, all right? Separate from the school administration is the Howard County Police. So the Howard County Police, and I think there's a civilian employee named Katie Turner, who kind of is the ombudsman or the point person for the Howard County Police on this. But there's a Howard County Police Youth Service, right? And it's they can separately divert any offenses that are not felonies and or traffic offenses. Felony and traffic offenses, they don't have any power over. But for misdemeanor offenses, they have the ability to divert those things. One of the principal mechanisms of diversion is teen court. Teen court in Howard County is a system where kids, fellow students, act as members of the justice system, and they act as judges, lawyers, defense counsel. They actually hear actual cases and act as juries, and they render a verdict as to whether or not they find the child fact sustained, which means they found the child was involved in a criminal activity, or whether they find the child was not involved in a criminal activity. If they find the child fact sustained, meaning they find the child was involved or the juvenile was involved in criminal activity, they recommend a sentence. Our chief judge in Howard County, which is Chief Judge William Tucker, oversees that process and enforces, generally speaking, unless there's something that's just really untoward that's happening or a result that's just inequitable. Judge Tucker will enforce the decision that's reached by the students. That's teen court. It involves youth in the actual justice system. They also have diversionary programs, restorative reflection programs, things of that nature, to kind of off-ramp the kids at the Howard County Police level. If it moves past the Howard County Police level, there's another off-ramp, which is the Department of Juvenile Services. They have the ability to divert, which means to move away from a criminal process, misdemeanors and felony offenses with SAO approval. So they can do felonies with our approval, and they can divert misdemeanors. And so what you see there, it's often minor cases, shoplifting, disorderly conduct, things of that nature. They can divert those cases so that they do not reach our attention. They don't reach the attorney's level. If the case moves beyond that, it then comes to our office. The state's attorney's office also diverts cases, right? One caveat: the Department of Juvenile Services, when they're diverting cases, they do their own intake, their own evaluation of the case. There are times where the victim can appeal the decision to divert the case, and they would appeal it to our office. They would reach out to our office and say, I don't believe this case should be diverted. I was harmed in a significant way, and I want this to proceed. We weigh those cases on a case-by-case basis and decide whether it should come to us or whether it should be diverted. At the State Attorney's Office level, again, we often divert cases. Of the 28 cases that came to us from March of 2019 to March of 2020, we diverted 8 of those cases. So 8 cases we decided were not appropriate for prosecution, and we handled them in a different way. We also, even if we were to prosecute the case, we have things called stets with conditions. Stet is essentially putting a case on a suspended docket. When a case is put on a suspended docket, it is speedy trial no longer continues. The case is held kind of in a stasis, if you will, and we provide conditions that the juvenile must meet in order for the case to be removed. It could be complete anger management. It can be paid restitution to the victims. Frequently, you'll see this in cases where someone will rob someone of their cell phone or steal a cell phone from someone, and the cell phone is lost. Today, a cell phone costs, a couple $100 to low $1,000 figure, and the youth will have to find a way to pay back the victim for the loss of their phone, right? And a step with conditions would simply be complete community service and complete paying restitution, and we can move forward. Next slide, please. All right. So as was discussed by Dr. Harris and Mr. Rudinsky, the SROs aren't just performing a law enforcement function. They actually are getting to know the kids. There are 2 anecdotes, and I understand that there are anecdotes on multiple sides of this issue and multiple perspectives related to this issue. But 2 that I think are very relevant are, in one instance, we had a young individual who was experiencing harm at home. There was both domestic violence and sexual assault occurring at home. That individual formed a relationship with their SRO, and as a result, they reached out to their SRO and told the SRO, this is going on in my house. That led to a detective to investigate the actual case. We found there was domestic violence occurring. We found there was sexual assault occurring, and we prosecuted those individuals and removed them from society. It's important to note that the relationship was there between the student and the SRO. The student didn't go to the teacher. The student didn't go to the guidance counselor. The student felt a tie with the SRO and went to the SRO. That is important about, it tells a lot about the relationships that they form. Additionally, the other issue that came up is the Glen Elk High School hate crime case. I think it's a pretty important anecdote. In 2018, it resolved in 2019 when I took office. There were 4 students who went to school at night, wearing masks, the Glen Elk High School, and they were there, and they spray painted racist, anti-Semitic, and homophobic graffiti all over the property. That case, I could tell you, would not have been solved absent the SRO's involvement. And the reason why is that despite them being there at night and despite them wearing masks, which would make identifying them difficult for regular law enforcement, the SRO, who was embedded in the school, knew who the students were. He saw the students, recognized the way they moved, how they were acting, and he's like, that is A, B, and C, A, B, C, D student. He knew their habits, so he knew that they would likely have their phones on them. He knew the school layout and the school services, and he understood the school systems. And so to confirm his hypothesis that it was students A, B, C, and D, he went to the Wi-Fi network of the school and saw that at the time that they were spray painting this hate-filled graffiti on the school property, these same students who we believed they were, their phones logged in to the Wi-Fi network at the same time. That would not have been a process that a regular police officer would have conducted. They would not have known about the school systems. They would not have known about the student body, would not be able to identify them in mass, and they wouldn't have known to check the Wi-Fi network. So this is a case that was solved in large part due to the SRO. Next slide, please.
Hey, Rich, real quickly, I hate to chime in, but actually, you know what? This is a great time to move to Q&A. So that's perfect. Want to be mindful of everyone's time and make sure that everyone who joined us today gets the chance to ask their questions. So we'll extend a little bit past 8 to make sure that you all have time to get it all in. I haven't had a chance to respond to everyone in the chat yet, but I am getting your questions over on my left. But we're going to go ahead and start with the pre-submitted questions first. Isabel, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you so you can ask your question and give you video. So just message me if you're having trouble.
Hi. No, that's good. Hi,
Awesome.
so my name is Isabella. I am a Howard County student, actually. I go to Marys Ridge High School. I'm a senior. So I noticed that you said that SROs are supposed to sort of act as an informal counselor. I would just like to ask, what makes them better than having actual counselors, having more social workers, more teachers, more coaches? What makes the SRO more efficient, especially considering the fact that SRO's jobs is to arrest children at some points?
I see a hand up from Mike. Mike, are you muted? Yes, you are. Give me 1 second.
All right, how's that? Are we
Okay.
there? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your question. And they're not better. There should be more counselors. There should be more nurses. There should be more social workers. Thank you. The SRO is just one added cog in the wheel that helps the village to raise a young person.
Okay. Great. Indira, I'm gonna throw it over to you, or I can just ask them. Why don't I go ahead and do that? It looks like that's maybe a little bit easier. So we may have touched on this a little bit, but the question is, please address the statistics in Howard County with regards to complaints against SROs. Do we have a problem with SROs in Howard County specifically? Do you want to start there? And there's a couple follow-ups here as well.
So I'll just answer that when there's complaints about law enforcement, if there's a violation of the law or a law enforcement officer that does something wrong, it gets handled one of two ways. There's administrative actions that are taken against them, and there can be criminal actions that are taken against them. So it is possible if the officer were to engage in a way that violated the individual's rights that led to a criminal charge, my office would prosecute that officer if they engaged in any kind of criminal conduct in the way that they were interacting with a student. I have not had any cases that have come to me where an SRO was alleged to have committed criminal conduct. Now, there's also stuff that's happening administratively with the police. I don't know if Mike, you can answer this or not, but the chief of the police would probably be the best person to provide stats on that. I don't know about the administrative findings. I've had no criminal requests have been forwarded to me related to the criminal conduct of any SROs in Howard County.
So it's a personnel issue, just like it is in anybody else's job. Now, obviously, police officers are public officials. The departments themselves would decide on when and how any of that information did get sent out to anybody. We obviously don't have that, nor do we have any oversight, of that type of thing with SROs. We just provide the training and help through the Safe to Learn Act.
Okay, awesome. So moving on to our next question. I don't see Megan Berger here, but I want to make sure I get her question in. So her question was, throughout Maryland and in Howard County, Black students are disproportionately targeted for school-based arrests, the vast majority of which are conducted by school police. According to MSDE's 2018 to 19 school-based arrest report, 56% of school-based arrests statewide targeted Black students, even though they're only a third of the student population. In Howard County, the figures are even more stark. Black students receive 64% of arrests, even though they are only 24% of the student population. Research indicates that these disparities occur because Black students are more likely to attend schools with officers, and because they are seen as more blameworthy even when they engage in the same behaviors as their white peers. If police presence in schools is criminalizing Black youth and disrupting their education, shouldn't we shift away from this model?
Who would you like to answer?
Right.
I was going to say, I mean, you know, one of the things, and we certainly talk about it internally at the Center for School Safety, you know, knowing full well that everyone has lots of questions about the data and about student arrest data over time that MSDE has collected, is that the training that occurred with all of the highlighted topic areas that I've told you about, that occurred in the summer of 2019 before the start of the 2019-2020 school year. So if you're trying to see or to measure the effectiveness of doing implicit bias training, doing that disability and diversity awareness training and everything, and mandating that across the board, not just for SROs, but for the school security employees, it would be measured the first set of data in the 2019-2020 school year, which went off the rails, thank you, COVID. So, you know, we only have a small snapshot of a year, and it's my understanding that the student arrest data, I believe, doesn't get to MSDE until fall. So the last year's student arrest data report would not be coming out for a bit yet. But that's generally speaking the time frame of when they do that, and they'll post that on their website.
And just to piggyback, we also know that, you know, the numbers of arrests, there are disproportionate numbers of different groups arrested. There's no argument whatsoever. The only thing that I can say to that is, we didn't even know if the people in schools were trained before 2019. Now they are. We're in a fledgling program, and we're actually extremely excited to see how this turns out, because we're one of the first states in the nation to do this. And like she said, thanks COVID, because we're not able to get our numbers.
One thing that we added to the training that's new, that just went into effect. So there was a law that passed during the last legislative session related to hate bias and hate crimes training that's mandatory for all law enforcement now. So it's required in the training academy now, and as in-service training every 3 years for officers. So we built that into that 40-hour program. So we added that in so that everyone who's getting trained now will get that automatically. So every SRO plus every school security employee will be trained in it. And that's important because issues, as you heard with the Glenelg case, but issues related to hate bias and hate crimes involve 28 to 35% of those involved with it, either as a perpetrator or a victim, are our school-aged population. And it's a great time to be able to intervene. But you can't intervene and understand and how to help with those sorts of things if school resource officers, teachers, school security employees aren't trained in it. So this is one positive step in that direction. And I could say that I came last year, last fall, along with David Engel, who's the director of the Maryland Coordination and Analysis Center. And we spoke to all of the principals and assistant principals, administrators during Dr. Martirano's monthly briefing sessions, specifically about this topic to give some better understanding. So, you know, there's a lot of things that we can do and should do and continue to do moving forward, but everything is a work in progress.
I just wanted to clarify something. Which I think I heard. I'm kind of learning along with the rest of you. But that was that, first of all, nobody's disputing the fact that Black and brown children are disproportionately arrested compared to white children. However, if we go back to the statistics, it looked like a majority of those arrests were coming from the administration in the community rather than SROs. Is that correct?
So you put two things together.
Yeah.
Senator Hester. So
that's why I'm asking for clarification.
So most of the cases that came to my office, right? So most of the times when there's a referral, there's an arrest, or there's a request for intervention. And by the way, I guess I should clarify that too. In the juvenile context, an arrest doesn't always equal you're put in cuffs. Sometimes we simply send a piece of paper to the parent of the child saying, your child has been alleged to have committed X, Y, and Z crimes. Please submit yourself and your child to the court on this date and time so that we can proceed, right? But most of the interactions that we're having are generated from the community, not the schools. Of the 255 cases from March of 2019 to March of 2020, 28 in total were from or associated with a school at all. And of the 28 associated with a school, there were 4 that were for regular patrol and the rest were SROs. So you're talking about a very small number that are coming from SROs. The slide that I believe Dr. Harris and Mr. Rudinsky spoke of was in terms of SRO involvement, separate topic. In terms of SRO involvement, they are frequently called to act by administrators in the schools versus something they see spontaneously and respond to. So the difference is school teacher or principal says, little Johnny is unruly or acting out, SRO, please come in and get involved, versus SRO sees little Johnny doing something that's a problem and then gets involved, if you follow that distinction.
And just to jump into that, to follow it up, that is why it's very important when you talk about having a school resource officer in the school, it's about having that effective relationship with the student. Because when we did our training in the first year, a lot of some of the feedback that we received was, how was the student and the SRO coming into contact? Was it being initiated by the school resource officer, or was it being initiated by the school administrator? And many times, in my years of experience with it, a lot of times the administrator is the one that's putting the school resource officer in a bad position out of fear. And let's just call it what it is. If you have a relationship with the kid, you should be able to walk through the building. If you see some students congregating where they should not be, you should have that kind of relationship and confidence to be able to say, let's get to class. A lot of times you have situations where the administrator may not have a relationship with the student. Out of fear, they just say, hey, can you just go tell that group to move from the cafeteria or the gymnasium, or take your hat off? Something that is a discipline matter that should be handled by the handbook now turns into a matter of you involve the school resource officer to that student who may not have a relationship with the student. So now you have a tug of war going back and forth. And so you really have to look at the relationship too, between the administrator and the school resource officer, because together collectively, they can help shape the culture of the school where you will not have the kind of arrest that's premature that's leading to the school to prison pipeline.
And I want to add one more caveat to that, because again, I think in Howard County, the school to prison pipeline argument, again, I act as a safeguard against that. My office acts as a safeguard against that. And as I described, there are many off-ramps that exist. So the volume of cases isn't there to support that argument. But additionally, the types of cases we see, we're not getting involved, and we're certainly not pursuing any cases where it's some kid stealing the teacher's apple or taking the teacher's stapler, or a small fist fight. We're getting involved in cases where kids are bringing weapons to school, kids are using weapons against each other, kids are stealing, robbing each other of personal property, or stealing someone's car. Like more serious, more egregious type cases. We're not getting involved in de minimis cases. And so I want to make sure the community is aware that we're not trying to criminalize non-criminal behavior, right? That's really not, that's not the goal. And there's ample room to discuss how SROs are dressed, what training SROs have, how SROs are selected, what privileges and rights SROs have while on school grounds, whether administration can call an SRO for de minimis things, or whether it's simply known that's off the books and they cannot do that. It's not an option. Those are things that we can discuss about in trying to formulate a conclusion that allows for public safety, but also acknowledges the very real and justified fears that people have from interacting with, overzealous law enforcement.
So we're having an excellent conversation on this question. I want to make sure we get to a wide array of the ones that were submitted, because we have a pretty long list here. So this next question is from Grant Vix. So it's, how are SROs utilized differently in different schools? What is the difference between a paper arrest and a referral arrest? This is a specific part that had come up in a couple questions here. Who makes the referral arrest? And then in a paper arrest, how are the outcomes measured? And then finally, in schools without SROs, what is the extent of police presence? So it's a couple questions there, but first, how about we talk about how are SROs utilized differently in different schools, and in schools without SROs, what is the extent of police presence?
Well, the SROs and the way they're utilized in the schools is up to the local school systems. Some of them are used generally to go into classrooms, to teach law-related education, to be in the hallways, to build relationships, to participate in most of the school events, to be part of the students' everyday life. That's the goal of that. Because this program is so new, some of them, prior to 2019 and the start of us training them and training their supervisors, some of them have been used more in the aspect of security in the school, which we don't advocate. They shouldn't be doing discipline. They're also used as emergency managers. They're training the staff on what to do in case of an emergency, because the reality is, let's face it, if the terminal happens, if there is that emergency in a school, the SRO is engaged or incapacitated. There is no other choice if they make the proper decisions. The school has to stand up the command post on their own, so they have to educate them as such. We train all of our SROs at the very last thing that they do inside of that school is law enforcement. That's not their primary objective, being in the school. Their primary objective, if you really had to know what it was, it's to keep the outside from coming in and to assist the administrators to deal with things which they've never been trained or equipped to deal with. To steal the state's attorney's term, anecdotally, the things that I could tell you that I've seen in schools, from extortions to where I worked, actually students that had been arrested for murders and investigations for gangs. When you get into that, the administrators were never taught or equipped to deal with that. And if they have to deal with that, it's taking them away from the education of the children. When you have a resource there to utilize for that purpose, you're aiding in that education to the children. State's Attorney, would you like to address the referral part?
Yes, absolutely. So referrals again there's an allegation that a youth has violated our laws in a criminal way, and that is evaluated, and it's evaluated at the administrative level of the school, it's evaluated at the police level, it's evaluated at the Department of Juvenile Services, and it's evaluated by my office, the attorney's office. The paper referral is essentially an arrest warrant, right? But as opposed to them putting handcuffs on a kid and bringing them in, there are times where they will contact the youth's parent, let them know, give them a piece of a document saying, your son or daughter is alleged to have committed these crimes. Please submit yourself with your child to the court on this date. In terms of, I didn't catch the exact question. In terms of measurement, obviously, if they were to ignore that notification, it would ratchet things up a bit, and police would go out and apprehend that individual. But typically speaking, parents comply and bring their child in, and the actual justice process is begun. We evaluate the case, meet with the victim, evaluate all the facts, meet with the police or anyone involved, witnesses, determine whether or not charges are appropriate. If we decide that there's a diversionary process that's merited, we divert the case and don't prosecute. If we decide the charges are merited, we decide how we're going to charge and how we're going to proceed. And there are times where situation is very egregious, and we're going to pursue a more draconian or stronger position. And oftentimes that's not the case. In juvenile law, again, our goal is to be rehabilitatively focused. Our office is the nuclear option, right? And we seek to avoid prosecuting and attaching the criminal justice to these kids if we can, right? Now that's a function of the child's behavior, the child's choices, and our options, right? But that's the path that is the referral process.
There is a stopgap as well for police officers. I don't know if anybody realizes this. I know the state's attorney obviously does, but when a police officer decides to arrest a child physically, put handcuffs on them, the farthest they can take that child is to the station. Mm-hmm. At that point, the officer must call the Department of Juvenile Services. The Department of Juvenile Services intake officer says, give them back to their parent or bring them forthwith to a holding facility. So it's completely up to the Department of Juvenile Services. The officer's authority stops right there at the station in that case.
Yep, agreed.
Okay, so a quick follow-up on that for you, Mr. Gibson. So out of the 24 referrals that were given to you this year, did you feel that any were inappropriate or just not necessarily correct in the way they were sent to your office?
So of the 24, we declined to prosecute 8. So there were 8 offenses that we looked at, evaluated, and said, you know what, there's another way to, either we don't want to prosecute this at all, or there's another way to handle this short of actually prosecuting this individual. Let's handle it that way. Again, as I said, we try to be rehabilitatively focused. But the kind of offenses we're seeing, they typically are, violent assaults where someone is injured in a serious way, weapons that are used or brought onto the school property. It's a real problem. We don't want weapons in our schools. Schools be a place of learning, not a place where kids are bringing weapons and harming each other. Robberies, thefts of vehicles, things of that nature that really, you have to take a very serious look at, because if you ignore that, it could exacerbate and it could lead to some real harm.
Gotcha. And a little follow-up question there as well. Jacqueline asked, what are the reasons for the 28 school referrals, and do we keep demographic makeup data? So I imagine that you can't talk about the specifics of the referral possibly, but do we keep track of the demographic data of these referrals, or is that not something?
No, we don't typically track race. As was alluded to earlier, I concur. It's a very sad fact that it is disproportionately Black and brown people that are exposed to the criminal justice system. I think, look, I try to keep it as factual as possible. I believe systemic racism is a thing. I think that when I say a thing, I believe it exists. I believe that throughout all our systems, whether it be medical, educational, law enforcement, financial, land use and zoning, there are disproportionate racial impacts that negatively affect people of color. And the law and justice system is no different, sadly. We are working to strive to find ways to address that while still maintaining public safety.
Fantastic. So I've kept Nicole waiting a little bit. I'm gonna go ahead and unmute her and have her video so that she can go ahead and ask her question. Sorry for the wait, Nicole. Okay, we can see you, but we can't hear you quite yet. I'm gonna try one more time.
There you go.
Okay. Oops, I didn't mean to have video on. But can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So before I ask my question, I just want to make sure I'm understanding something correctly. So with the student arrest data that was provided in the superintendent's report, is it correct that that data isn't really applicable now because this more comprehensive SRO training program wasn't initiated until 2019? So we're really starting fresh in terms of being able to compare results.
Yeah, the data report I mentioned was for the academic year 2018-2019. That's the last report that's posted on MSDE's website for student arrest, and that predates the mandatory 40-hour SRO school security employee training program.
Okay. Thank you. And then my question is, what is the criteria for evaluating SRO effectiveness, and how frequently are they evaluated?
That's an extremely good question. That's done by the police departments and the local school systems. We recommend during training that through their MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding that they must have, that they enumerate how they're going to do that. We recommend that the school have limited supervisory capability over the SRO in that they have input into the evaluation. When I was working, that was the model that we used. The principal was able to talk to my supervisors and together come up with my evaluation to see what the effectiveness was, whether I was doing my job or not doing my job. There is nothing in writing at the state level that I know of that deals with that, but we're asking that local school systems and departments come to that place together to figure that out.
And that was part of the module that we teach on the MOUs. You know, that I say that should be evaluated every year. At the conclusion of every school year, the school system and the local law enforcement departments that provide SROs should be sitting down and doing that housekeeping and talking about, you know, what might need to be fixed, what went well, what didn't go well, and do that preparation for the next school season. And that any adjustments that need to be made to that written document that governs their work there need to be addressed.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Could I just follow up and ask, so is that the same, the evaluation of an SRO and having that be at the local level, is that the same as a regular police officer with the exception that the school system has input to the supervisor? And to ask the question another way, there's nothing at the state level that goes towards the evaluation of all police officers. It's all done locally. Is that correct?
That's correct. And there's also a difference between personnel, job measurement, and assessment of what they should be doing. And we work with them on that as well.
That's helpful.
Okay, awesome. So we have another question here that I'm just going to read off. This is a question about arrests from Renuka. I'm going to say your last name wrong, so I'm going to apologize in advance. Reggie. So the Howard County Police Department has said that most of its arrests are paper arrests without handcuffs, but research shows that arresting a child, regardless of how the arrest is executed, makes it much more likely that the child will drop out of school. How does the school system reconcile its goal of graduating all its students with its system of putting officers in schools who have the authority and obligation to arrest students, including for childhood behaviors like fighting and being disruptive? I would go ahead and maybe make the disaggregation here that no one here represents the school system, so I just want to be really clear about that aspect. But maybe the part that we can address with this panel is the part on the authority and obligation to arrest students, including for childhood behaviors like fighting and being disruptive. We kind of mentioned this earlier, that there's some discretion. Could we expand upon the discretion that SROs have in those diversion points just a little bit more there?
So as far as the arrests go for the mays and shalls that we talked about, one of the things that we're starting to really work with, and Dawn and I have been racking our brains in doing this, is the thought and policy of police departments in the state that if a parent requests that an opposing child in a fight be arrested, the SRO or police officer must do that. There's nothing in state law that says that. However, departments have that in individual policy. At the state level, in our agency, we're starting to pull all the data points together and have meetings with the Department of Juvenile Services and the local police departments to stop those policies from happening. In addition to that, we're training our officers in restorative practices. Restorative practices is a very big part of how to work with young people to make them understand what in fact they may have done that was wrong, and how to engage them in learning and growing out of doing things like that, and to make reparations to the community and not just hold them culpable through the court system for their events. So hopefully the SROs, when we start collecting data, are working with the schools on that, because that's now what they've been trained in.
And then also too, you in some jurisdictions, you have your school resource officers that have a very good relationship with the school security staff. And when you operate through restorative practices, and if you have a relationship with that young man or that young lady, even if that school resource officer intervenes, it may not evolve into a matter of criminal, because that relationship with that security officer may be able to come in and between the school security officer and that school resource officer and that administrator working together to allow that student a second opportunity, as opposed to just arresting them right away.
Nathan, you're muted. We can't hear you.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you so much. So as we close down, we're closing in on 8:30 here. We said we would go to 8, but I want to make sure that we get everyone's questions in. I have two more questions here for you that I think are pretty interesting that I just want to make sure we address here. The first one is from Tracy Jones. So the question there is let's see, sorry about that. If students have a complaint against an officer who receives that information, and does that go in a personnel file? So really, what happens with complaints for SROs?
So that information would be turned over to internal affairs, right? In the police department, Lisa Myers is the chief of police. And if it were a criminal allegation, so in other words, if there were an allegation that an officer violated someone's rights in a way that led to a criminal charge, that would come to me. My office, the attorney's office, would evaluate. If we determine that the violation did rise to the level of criminal, we would pursue the case against the SRO. Again, we have not had that occur.
Okay, it looks like Tracy has one follow-up question. I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you, Tracy. Are you seeing a prompt that says unmute? There we go.
Okay, thank you. So my question, I wanted to follow up to that because I don't think it always has to be something that's a criminal act. I think with students, some things are in terms of a relationship. If there's something that was said inappropriate or something discriminatory, I think that's what students would be probably more exposed to, like microaggressions or anything, or implicit bias situations. Those are the things that I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. But also, are the SROs a part of the school improvement team or the student support team? Because then if you're talking about building relationships, that's where those students that come up that are either at risk or need additional support. I hear a lot of things in terms of the relationship connected to either a law or a rule or breaking a rule or breaking the law, but I don't hear where if you're building the relationship, it's got to be before that. It's got to be before the kids escalate to some sort of breaking the law or anything like that. So that's where my concern is that if you're talking about relationships, the things that I've heard are grounded in something related to a law enforcing a law or rule, not really getting to know the student so that's what's building a relationship.
So Tracy, I'm sorry, go ahead, I'm sorry, I'll defer.
Well, I mentioned the behavioral threat assessment team earlier, right? And that was a component of this law. And the way that that's put together, it puts together people who have expertise in law enforcement, school counseling, classroom instruction, and school administration. So it's that team approach. And that is so that people can intervene and have those roundtable discussions. I'm seeing something a little, the teacher's there's something wrong in class. So-and-so has not done well on the past few quizzes and seems like something's a little off. The officer may know that there was something that happened or there was a call for service at the kid's house, right? And that something else is going on at home. So then they may say, well, who here can talk to the child and have a good discussion? And maybe the counselor, right? So then all three of those people, the classroom teacher, the SRO, and the counselor have pulled together about what their observations are and figure out a strategy to that particular student. And that's, sort of the base level when you're first starting to notice that something may be wrong. There are obviously more serious issues that need to be dealt with in the threat assessment, sort of when you're talking about not just getting interventions and wraparound services, but where it's a clearly significant risk. And that is, again, the goal is to get involved before something happens rather than as it's happening or responding to. So the effort from everyone's perspective, whether it's the mental health folks or the SROs, the teachers, and the administrators, is on the before.
And I'll just jump in.
I'm sorry. Yep.
I'm sorry, just real quick, just to piggyback off what Dawn was saying, again, in my years of experience in working with kids, rules without relationships, students rebel. And so if you wait until a situation arises without having that relationship, those are times where a situation turns into a crisis. And then that's also important for that administrator too, to put his team in a position to win. And so like any good coach. And so if you know the skill set of your school resource officer, and as Dawn suggested with the behavioral threat team, that school resource officer being a part of that team, is also good to make sure that that school resource officer and that principal have that kind of established relationship where that school resource officer is not just sitting in their car in front of the school, or not just sitting in front of the cafeteria bored, not wanting to be there, but really have a heart for kids. You know, I use the example all the time that if I was going into law enforcement, I'm an educator, but if I'm going into law enforcement and I'm fearful of animals and I don't like dogs, I wouldn't want to be a canine officer. And so I want to make sure that I'm putting my best person in a position to win. And so to your point, Mrs. Tracy, you know, and one way that that school resource officer can have a positive interaction with your son or daughter is to have more responsibilities throughout that school building, not just being shown in his uniform where he's wearing the police uniform. Maybe he wears a polo one day. Maybe one day he comes in with a sweatsuit to kind of change the perception that law enforcement, they're people too. But the more involvement that they have, such as, you know, maybe serving breakfast to teachers on Teacher Appreciation Day, or opening up the door for students as they enter the building every day, or giving high fives, or meeting them at the bus every morning. Just looking at little wins, little W's to build some credit in these kids so that when something happens, they can say, you know, my SRO, I can go to he or she. Not my SRO, not what I'm seeing on these viral videos, because we can look everywhere and say there's bad teachers, there's bad administrators, that we can look at that across the board. But again, the more opportunities that we have to engage in that relationship with those students, and they know that you care about them, that kind of helps level the playing field before a crisis erupts. And
as I kind of alluded to, again, it's an anecdote, and they're anecdotes from all different angles. But again, during my tenure, we had a case where a student sought out the SRO. They had a relationship with this SRO. They valued that person. They trusted that person, and they were going through some really horrible things at home. There violence, domestic violence, sexual assault that was happening in the home, and they didn't go to the guidance counselor. They didn't go to the teacher. They didn't go to the principal. They had a relationship. They trusted the SRO. They sought the SRO out because they felt that person could solve the issue, might be able to address the issue, and they trusted them with their problems. And so that doesn't happen just spontaneously. Trust is earned and built, right? And look, you know, I get it that you know, some people have fears related to police, and we have to acknowledge that, and there's validity in that. But there's also, if we work to build relationships, there's real good that can be achieved, you know, and in this instance, we stopped some really horrible stuff from happening because that young lady trusted that SRO.
I wanted to tag on.
Can I just add one other thing, please? Ms. Clay, first of all, thank you so much for your question, because you made me realize that maybe I don't present things as well as I should. The relationships that our SROs build or are supposed to build have nothing to do with rules or law enforcement. Rules are school discipline they shouldn't be involved in. Law enforcement is the very last thing they should do. They should be in that building, making eye contact and getting to know the young people on a daily basis as human beings. That's what we want. The majority of our SROs that I know, and myself included, thought that the children in the building were his, and God help you if you come in to do something to one of my kids. So thank you. I'll try to do better at explaining that in the future.
I appreciate the response. I think this was great to hear all sides. I think it's beneficial. That's why I came.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just give a shout out to Rich, because he came to my school and read to my kiddos in elementary school.
Glad to do it. Let me know when I can do it. Oh, hopefully we'll be able to do it again soon.
Oh, you know I'm gonna call you virtually. Look for my email.
Need me, I'm there.
Okay, well, I just want to say a few words and then we'll wrap up for the night. Just picking up on the last conversation. I mean, if you think about, you know, the bigger context that we're in, I think often the mental and behavioral health concerns of our students aren't being adequately addressed. And there was the very first person on, you know, asked why an SRO was more important than a school counselor. And I think Mike said, you know, they weren't, we're just all part of the system. And so there's some good news that I wanted to highlight. When the legislature passed the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, HB 1300, part of that, which was a late added amendment, which I worked on with a bipartisan group of senators, created coordinated community supports partnerships. And basically what that did is it first of all established a consortium to look at the mental health issue. And then it developed a model where the schools were going to work with the local community providers and help to provide these wraparound services to take some of the weight off of the teachers and the SROs from providing that mental health angle, and to leverage federal dollars to do that. And so in that piece of the bill, there was $300 million between 2022 and 2026, which is a lot more money than we have right now. And then that would leverage federal funds. So I just wanted to flag that and say that, you know, depending on what happens in January, you know, that piece hopefully will be implemented. And I just want to thank everybody. You know, I've been watching the participant screen. I think we started off with about 40 people. We ended with about 40 people. So some of these issues that we look at, they're really not black and white. I think this is a complicated issue. And so I just want to applaud all 40 some people who stayed with us tonight to listen to the statistics and to try to seek to, you know, educate themselves. And I, for one, certainly learned, you know, a great deal. And I want to thank Mike and Dr. Harris and Dawn and Rich. Thank you all for being on and answering some of these tough questions. In terms of next steps, I just wanted to mention that our office will be sending out the information to folks, including some of the ways to get involved in the Howard County Public Schools, like town hall that's coming up. And also, I wanted to flag that later this year, November 17th to be precise, we're going to be hosting a state summit that looks at mental health in the criminal justice system. And so that will be another opportunity to learn more. So once again, I just really want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, both our speakers and our participants. And if you ever, you know, have any questions at the state level, you know, feel free to contact my office and we'll do the best to try to find you the answer if we don't know it ourselves. So on that note, thanks everybody.
I would just have one more request. If there's any feedback you have from this, please send us an email to our public inbox so that we can kind of learn from this process and improve on it moving forward. So that'll be the last thing that I jump in with. Thanks so much.
Good night,
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.